everyone, it's Raina. So this video is if you have your Neptune in Sagittarius, and this will be for those people who were born between November 1970 and January 1984. Neptune, like Pluto, is a generational planet, and it has approximately a 15-year cycle, although from the years that are given on this site that I looked up the dates on, it seems like it's less than 15 years. And they say here millennial number one. I have no idea what that means, because most of the people that are born when Neptune was in Sagittarius are actually Generation Xers. I'm the first year of Generation X, and I actually have my Neptune in Scorpio. So not all Gen Xers have Neptune in Sagittarius, but I don't know why they say millennial number one. I think there were a couple of years where millennials at the tail end have Neptune in Sagittarius. Many of them have it in Capricorn, and I've already done a video on that. So Neptune has this uber idealistic influence that it's connected to, and it certainly is spiritual. It certainly is dreamy, creative, but also quite gullible and, and also gentle and things like that, spiritual, psychic even. And Sagittarius it's interesting because Sag is one of the houses. That's a God house or a spiritual house. The three houses that I think of as spiritual are the 8th house, the 9th house, and the 12th house. Pisces Neptune rules the 12th house. And to me, that's more of the totality of your spiritual influence via other lifetimes and how that plays into things now, because the 12th house is the dream state. So sometimes people have dreams, and they're prophetic dreams, or they also hint at their past lives. They may visit other realms in their sleep, astral project, what have you. Karma is associated with the 12th house, past lives and that kind of thing. The Akashic records. The 8th house, to me, are the secrets of the universe, the other side. So death, that transformation, and the communication with those who have crossed over. And the 9th house, which is Sagittarius's house, is the house of God and organized religion in particular. Now, with Neptune and Sagittarius, this was a decade in the 1970s where there was a lot of talk about cults. I grew up in the 1970s. I remember what happened in Guyana with Jim Jones. And I remember seeing the cover of Newsweek or what have you. And now later on, as time has gone on, I believe that it was something other than what it was portrayed, that it wasn't what they said it was, but that there was mind control being exerted over those people. So, Neptune, like I said, can be very gullible. And so in Sagittarius, it's gullible about religion, but other philosophies as well. Now, it's not to say that there's never been any cults since the 1970s, but there was a very strong emphasis. I mean, I remember being a kid, and they would talk about, I forgot what that term was, when you recapture the person and you deprogram them. And they would be talking about that, the Moonies, the Hare Krishnas, these groups. And as somebody who goes to the Krishna temple on occasion, I really believe that things have changed for the better. Obviously, anytime that you belong to some kind of a group, and especially if you live on the premises, you're going to cut yourself off from the mainstream society. And depending on the person's mental state, that can make them more susceptible to mind control. But there are also infiltrators who hijack, organizations and do their stuff that way too. So you never know why something is happening. And that's another aspect of Neptune, is deception, is that somebody is using religion to deceive someone. And so another thing that I want to bring out about this is that the number 7 for the 70s is about introspection and the spiritual side, even solitude and things like that. And coming from the 1960s and all the noise of that decade, the 70s were much more introspective. They were much more about going within. The 60s were very loud. And the reason they were loud was because there was so much massive change. If you start from the beginning of the decade until the end, it's just like, I don't think there's another decade like the 1960s that people had to make such radical leaps in their consciousness. And so the thing is that in the 1970s, it was like people were really having to process what they had learned. But there's also, a lot of people think of the 60s as a time when everybody was taking psychedelics and all that stuff. But the true fact of that is that a lot of people started smoking pot and using psychedelics in the 1970s. Not to say that nobody did in the 60s, but it filtered down into more of the mainstream society. I mean, all you have to do is look at Woodstock. Not everybody had, hair down to their belly button, things like that. There were a lot of very straight-looking people, and that was 1969. So the 1970s, and I remember being a little kid and seeing, young men with hair, and I thought they were girls from the back. And then they, I remember giggling about it because, I assumed they were a girl, and then they turned around and I saw that they were a guy with long hair. It was just like ubiquitous back in the early 70s, but it was not that commonplace in the 60s. So the thing about Neptune is that it puts kind of a spell on people. And with Sagittarius, it's all about belief systems. So you see in the 1970s that there was a lot of confusion, and that's the power of Neptune as well. There was a lot of confusion about how somebody wanted to live. And you can see that through different movies that were kind of seminal. I don't even know if I'm using that word correctly. But one of them that comes to mind was one of my favorite movies. And I was probably it was in the last half of the 70s, probably around 1977. And I was about 12 years old or 11 years old when it came out. It was called An Unmarried Woman. And the reason that I really love that movie is because it's a time capsule of the 1970s, of going to an analyst and taking a lover, as they would say, and all of those things. These were all kinds of ways of feeling out, how does a person want to live? An unmarried woman, a woman who's getting divorced, how does she navigate the world? There was a lot more divorce. It was not as taboo as it had been before. So Neptune and Sagittarius had a lot to do with the spiritual beliefs as well. And In the site that I just brought up, they talk about the New Age. And by the way, I just give a shout out. This is a blog, and it's called barefootphilosopher.press. I don't know if that's part of WordPress or what, but that's what it's called. But the thing that the New Age movement is not new, and I mean it's far from new, but it was coined at some point New Age. And I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming it was sometime in the 70s when it was used to describe the current type of beliefs that we would see as New Age beliefs. And the difference, the interesting thing about this is because the New Age, or spirituality, which we could also call it, is different from what Sagittarius and Jupiter in the ninth house represent, because I believe those are much more about organized religions. And the reason that this is an important distinction is because when you have an organized religion, it has its own set of dogma, its own do's and don'ts, its own way of right living. And when you talk about being spiritual versus being religious, it's very open-ended. Well, that makes a lot of sense because Neptune is not about boundaries. It's like boundaryless. So there is that discomfort in trying to live a life that is moral, an ethical life, when there isn't this list of do's and don'ts. How do you navigate that? And so there's always like this nebulous quality. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is I like to tie things to the generations, because these influences to what has been happening in society, because there is a real need to focus on some of these influences and really ask ourselves whether or not they were overall helpful or whether they led us astray. And with Neptune, there's always that danger of being led astray. And so I think one of the greatest legacies of this influence was to make more mainstream the concept of embracing beliefs that don't have to conform to this neat and tidy little cookie cutter ideology. Neptune also is not about judgment. And you can see in many religious systems of thought that the do's and don'ts, the don'ts, carry with it a lot of condemnation. And I've heard people talk about moral relativism and saying that there's too much of that in these kinds of spiritual beliefs, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, because even if you follow a open-ended kind of religion, or I would call it like your own spiritual path, even if that is more open-ended, it doesn't mean that anything goes necessarily. You probably draw the line somewhere. But that was one of the fears that I guess you would say religious people have about spirituality, is that it doesn't seem to have very strong boundaries, and therefore it can be easy to explain something away or blame an outer entity instead of accepting responsibility for what the person actually practices or believes, at the very least. And one thing about Sagittarius is that it can be very preachy, and sometimes this can lend itself, if people are not careful, to whatever their opinions are, just wanting to impose them on others, thinking that they have the moral authority, if you will, and that can be a deluded state, which Neptune can provide. So it's very interesting. I was trying to figure out the younger age, the youngest age of somebody who has this, like who was born in 1984. How old are they? Well, the youngest would be turning 38 this year, I guess. So that's pretty amazing. What I would say about that is, if somebody grew up between these years, 1970 and 1984, and they have a rather arrogant belief patterns that they try to impose on others, obviously that's not a good idea, but that could be where it's coming from. And this is something that social media uses such people to always be arguing with people and really trying to force other people to accept their beliefs. Learning to see one's own beliefs and not needing other people to join your cult. That to me is a really important thing to be able to accomplish. I also think it's important to be able to see the areas in a particular religion that don't really work. Not to worship something blindly, like Neptune would have you do. The other possibility of Neptune meeting up with Sagittarius, is that it can make a person really cling to academia in that way, almost like joining the cult of academia, because Sagittarius rules the ninth house of higher learning. And so there might be some people in the crowd with this placement who are really enamored by academia or higher education, the college scene, whether it's their learning or if they actually teach a subject. And they really put a value on their intellect in that way. But depending on the person who has this placement, it can really let down another person, because they show, if they are going along with something, that there are limitations to the intellect, because the material world is temporary, it's finite. It feels like it's limitless because we're always being stimulated. We have all this energy coming from life itself to be injected into things. Some people are more religious than others or more spiritual than others. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it's when someone really joins the cult of, whether it's religion or whether it's the academic process, that they can become dulled or limited by the emphasis being placed on the so-called higher order learning. So the bottom line is that this is a generation that started to put an emphasis on the spiritual through the belief that these people had. So this was like the advent of that New Age movement that I really, quite honestly, I think was more prevalent in the latter half of the 80s than any other time. And so, yes, it is something from the past. It didn't just get invented in the last few decades, but it still is something that when it was in its beginning stages, they might not have called it New Age at the very beginning, but the belief systems were already set into place long before then. It's interesting because my partner happened to bring home a book the other day by Shakti Gawain. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. And the name of the book was called Creative Visualization. And from what I understand, she had a lot of success with that book as well. The book I was familiar with by her was called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. I think that was, I don't know if you'd call that her breakthrough book. And that came out during the 80s, probably, I would like to say 86 or 87 or something like that. I could be wrong. But when he brought home this book and I saw it was by her and I was looking at it, it reminded me so much of those books you see today. And I believe the publication date was like 1978 or something like that. Well, that would have been during Neptune in Sagittarius. And these kinds of things take time to reach the mainstream. All of these little influences. So the challenge is to use spirituality, or we could say religion especially, as a tool for self-growth rather than escapism, which Neptune can sometimes be, and to also inject that spirituality into an organized religion. When I say organized religion, there's established religions, but then you could say the offshoot. If somebody is, was raised a Christian, like I was raised a Christian, and it was kind of a liberal Christian, but it wasn't mystical Christian. And as an adult, I have attended Unity Church services, and they, I think I've heard them characterize themselves as Bible-based or something like that. And they do have quotes from the Bible, but they are definitely New Age, New Thought. They talk about some of those concepts that pertain to the New Age. It's like they're trying to, I was going to say they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, but no, they do identify with some of those Christian teachings, but they put their own spin on it that makes them much more, to me, proactive in how they conduct themselves and, maybe how they encourage people to be. And these kinds of things are the constructive ways of taking these religious structures that stand on their own and yet infusing some mystical elements to it. So, and that can be done. But the negative side is when people use religion as escapism, when they use the intellectual faculties as a means to spiritually bypass and get around having to really think very deeply about things, using abstract concepts to kind of keep away anything that talks about God, and just be overly in the mind and concerned about keeping religion out of one's life because of bad experiences that certain people were exposed to and things like that. I think that Neptune can actually work pretty well with Sagittarius because there's a prophetic quality of Sagittarius that Neptune also possesses in a certain way. And so this generation, spanning from the early 50s, as I record this, until about the age of 38. Okay, well, that's what I have for you. I hope that this resonated. If you would like a personal reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.